The founder of the nation's largest gang intervention program was born in Los Angeles and returned there as pastor of the poorest community in the region after he was ordained a priest. During his first years at the Dolores Mission Church, more than 150 young people were buried, the result of violence, leading Father Greg and the community to address the escalating problems and unmet needs of gang-involved youth. Today, what began as a vision to create an environment providing training, work experience, and above all, the opportunity for rival gang members to work side by side is a thriving intervention and reentry program in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, the largest in the nation and a model for the world. Homeboy Industries, nonprofit economic development enterprise, employs more than 250 former gang members. Father Greg's New York Times best-selling book, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion, has received several awards and was the first-year read at Gonzaga in 2010 when this year's graduating class began. Father Boyle has made several visits to campus over the past decade, often accompanied by individuals for whom Homeboy Industries has provided a new way of life. In recognition of a covenant of compassion in true kinship with those burdened by violence and for a living faith that gives glory to God, Gonzaga University proudly bestows its highest honor on Father Gregory J. Boyle of the Society of Jesus, the de Smet Medal.
I had no idea I was bald. Thank you, Gonzaga, for pointing that out. It's indeed a privilege to be with all of you, especially the class of 2015, because when you were freshmen, all of you were forced against your will to read my book. And some of you actually read it. But as you know, it's the privilege of my life to work at Homeboy Industries and for 30 years to have accompanied men and women, thousands and thousands of gang members. The day will never come when I have more courage or I am more noble or I am closer to God than these folks. People like Luis Perez, who is one of the handful of gang members who actually runs Homeboy Industries, gang member, been to prison, tattooed. He's also become something of a public speaker in his own right, and we had dinner recently, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. He said, you know, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. So brace yourselves. It's appropriate, I think, actually to brace yourself, because what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said about your time here at Gonzaga. It's not the place you've come to, it is the place you go from. And you go from here hoping to make the world look different than it currently looks. You go from here and you imagine with God a circle of compassion, and then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You go from here and you decide to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And you find your way to stand out at the margins, because if you stand at the margins, look under your feet, occasionally they get erased because you chose to stand there. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and you stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. All of you have had that exquisite experience to be able to stand even with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. This is not the place you've come to. It has always been the place you go from. And you stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. You obliterate the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them. You choose with great intention to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Because there is this one thing that is at the root of all that's wrong with the world. And this idea would be that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. You stand against that idea, and you choose to stand at the margins in awe of what the poor have to carry, rather than in judgment at how they carry it. So when you were freshmen, I was invited to come and speak at the COG or the Cataldo, I can't remember exactly. And I brought two homies with me because I was invited to bring a couple. And I always choose homies to pick. I always bring enemies, rivals, just so that they can share a hotel room together, just to mess with them a little bit. Although this time we stayed with Joe and Deb at their house. And I always pick homies who have never flown in their lives, just for the thrill of watching them panicked in the sky. So I brought two homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked at the time in our bakery, and Mario, a tall drink of water, Latino gang member who worked in our retail store. And I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times, thousands of times really, with men and women. Never have I taken anybody on a trip more terrified of flying than this guy Mario. He was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet. So we're at Burbank Airport, and it's a small airport, and big bay windows, and Southwest Airlines, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute where you go onto the plane, you have to walk out to the tarmac and walk up the steps, which are the front of the plane or the back of the plane. And so we're waiting there, and our plane arrives. It's early morning, and I said, "There's our plane," and he's still hyperventilating. I think he may actually die before we climb up those steps. And so then I see our flight attendants, two women with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps, and Mario is more desperate than before, and he says, "When are we going to board the plane?" And I said, "As soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I had never been in public with Mario before, so we were walking in Burbank Airport, and I watched people, when they see him, kind of step back, because Mario is about the most heavily tattooed individual ever to work at Homeboy Industries, which is saying a great deal. He's all sleeved out, his whole neck is blackened, his whole head is covered, but for a circle here on his face where his nose and eyes and mouth are covered in tattoos. And I'm noticing, mothers are vaguely clutching their kids more closely. which is interesting because if you were to ask anybody today at Homeboy Industries who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works there, they wouldn't say me. They'd say Mario. He's just effusive in his kindness and gentleness. He told me once, I've decided to be kind and gentle in the world, and who knows, maybe the world will return the favor. On the plane, even as terrified as he was, the flight attendant would hand him peanuts, and he wouldn't just take them and he wouldn't just thank her. He grabbed her hand and he looked her in the eyes and said, "Thank you so much." It was like way over the top, and so we get to Gonzaga, and this happens occasionally where they tell you you have that one talk, and then you discover that they've planned 93 other talks for you. This class and this class and this lunch and this meeting and this class. And so I told Bobby and Mario, I said, I'm not going to speak at any of these. I'd like you to speak. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. And they got up and they did a good job. And so they told stories of their lives of torture and neglect and abandonment and terror. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. And so the time came for the big talk that night, and it was standing room only, and students, I remember, were sitting in front of the podium, and I asked them, I want the two of you to get up and do a little 5-minute snapshot so that I can include you in the question and answer. And maybe some of you graduates remember this. And so they did, and they were good, and I did my 45 minutes. And then I said, okay, questions. And a woman over here, I remember she stood and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. Very first question out the gate is for Mario. And he's terrified. He stands up at the microphone. Yes. She says, well, you say you're a father and that you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario stood at the microphone terrified, and he closed his eyes, and he's getting a hernia coming up with the right answer. And he doesn't know what to say when suddenly he blurts out, I just. And as soon as he says those two words, he crumbles under the weight of it, and he closes his eyes, and he's trembling, and he's clearly crying, and most assuredly overwhelmed with emotion. But he wants to get this sentence out when finally he says, I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence. When the woman who asked the question stands again, and now it's her turn to cry. And she looks at him and she's trembling and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And like 1,000 people stood and they began to clap, and they wouldn't stop. And all Mario could do was to hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself. And everybody in that room that night found themselves returned to themselves as well. This is not the place you've come to. It's always been the place you will go from. And you will go praising God in the only way that matters. And a room full of strangers returning Mario to himself is the only praise God has any interest in. You brace yourselves as you stand on the margins, and then you cease to care that people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. You go from this place to make those voices heard. And may God bless the class of 2015 as you go forth to do exactly that.